crisis, and I wondered if you felt the same.
I did, and I rather wished I didn't, but I've always thought that accident and miscalculation play a very large part in human affairs, that we can act in ways that we may think are perfectly reasonable, but others looking at us may see as threatening or worrying. And I think we see this, happening in Ukraine, and we certainly saw it happening before the First World War. I think what you also get is nations feeling that they have to do things for the sake of prestige or honor. In the 19th century, they would have called it honor. Today, they call it credibility or prestige. But I think what's operating in Russia at the moment is something that was operating and has always operated in history, a sense by powers that they have to assert themselves or no longer be considered powers. And I think Putin has been very, like many Russians, very affected by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disappearance of much of the Russian Empire. I mean, he lived through the 1990s when Russia was in a very bad way, and I think what we're seeing now is Russia and Putin certainly wanting to reassert themselves and show that they still matter, and that's dangerous for all of their neighbors. And what I think makes Ukraine dangerous is now what the response will be and what the next steps will be, and I think we all have to hope that at some point cooler heads will prevail. So I'd say a prayer tomorrow myself, but...
I guess it was partly that mix of militarism, but also individual leadership that struck me too. That Putin strikes me as a bit of an outlier in today's world leaders, in that he still does talk about honor.
Yes, I think it's always difficult in history to get a balance between the sort of objective forces. I mean, you have to look at the Russian economy, Russian society, Russian military power to try and understand it. And I think you also have to look at Russian history. I always believe that you can't understand a people in a country without understanding their history. But I do think the individual leaders can often matter. And Putin, yes, is in some ways an anomaly. I mean, I think he's very tied up. He sees himself, I think, as being very much part of Russia. A Canadian diplomat who met him once said that he would talk quite offhandedly about my predecessor, Peter the Great, which is a bit worrying, I think.
Yes.
And I also found it worrying, and perhaps this is unfair to say, and please don't think I'm being unkind to men, but when men of a certain age start showing off their muscles and baring their chests, you wonder what's going on here. You know, and there's been this whole sort of macho thing. I mean, do you remember he was wrestling with a tiger, which turned out to have been was completely tranquilized, but nevertheless, there was Putin wrestling with the tiger. And I think he sees himself as this very sort of embodiment of Russian power and Russian strength. And it's I think, he's obviously identifying himself very closely with Russia and Russian greatness.
And I guess it has been easy to dismiss him in the last few years precisely because of that behavior. And that made me wonder whether there's a bit of a parallel there, in that I find with my students particularly, it's very easy for them to dismiss the leaders and the followers of 1914 because they see them as so different to us. It's I guess, a form of the Downton Abbey effect, that they were naive, we are sophisticated. Yeah. And yet, I think I'm right in suggesting that you'd argue for a greater understanding rather than a dismissal of the 1914 generation.
I think so. I think what's always difficult in history is, of course, we know how the story turns out.
Right.
And so we look back when they say what idiots they were. They didn't see what was going to happen. And we also, I think, often assume that we're cleverer than people in the past. We know more. We have computers. They didn't have computers. We have access to all sorts of information which they didn't have. And so I think that we fall too easily into the trap of condescending towards the past. And I think when you're trying to understand the past, you have to understand what it was that they were working with, what they could have done, ways in which they could have thought. I mean, you can't expect people in the Middle Ages to think like people in the 21st century. You just can't. You have to try and understand their worldview and their sets of constraints and values. But I think also what's important is not to look at the past and say they're completely different from us. They're wearing different clothes. The insides of their bodies and their minds and their emotions must be different too. And I've always thought it's important to try and understand both the times but the people. And they are individuals. They are, of course, products of their times, just as we're products of our time. And we think in certain ways because we live in a certain time, in a certain society, in a certain milieu. But I do think it's important to try and understand the personalities, because I think they matter in history. I mean, they don't always matter, and history is not just made by a particular leader, but sometimes it matters who's in the office, because in particular offices people can have a lot of power. I mean, I think it really mattered after September the 11th, you know, the blowing up of the World Trade Towers and the attacks on other sites in the United States, it really mattered that you had George Bush in the White House. And it mattered that you had Tony Blair in Downing Street. I think without those two men, there would not have been an invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I do think it matters at times, not always, but there are times when it actually does matter because someone has the power to say yes or no. And so I think I always want to try and understand those people. What are their characters? What are they worrying about? The German chancellor in 1914 had just lost his wife, and he was a pessimist by nature, and he was particularly sort of down and pessimistic at this point. And as the war, or the prospect of war became closer, he said things like, well, what does it all matter anyway? You know, and I do think, I find this interesting. I mean, I ask myself, did it affect his decisions? Did he just give up? And so I think, you know, we always speculate, but I do think it's important to try and understand the key figures in the past.
You make the point that in the years leading up to 1914, things had not actually been all sweetness and light, that actually there had been several assassinations of aristocrats. You talk about the anarchist threat, and again, kind of coming back to people who said, what does it all matter? And yet, Prince Ship's assassination of Ferdinand was a real trigger. And I wonder if you just wouldn't mind briefly sketching what you think the major threads were that made that event so key.
Well, I think, or at least this is what I tried to argue, I mean, the trouble with the First World War is this, you know, you can argue everything every which way. There's so many possible causes. But what I tried to look at was the sort of balance that there was in Europe, as there is in I think, our own present day, between those who thought war was a prospect, even welcomed the prospect of that war, or thought it was going to come, and those who thought that we've had such a long period of peace, it's bound to continue. And I think you can look back into the Europe of the years, the decades before 1914, and see the forces pushing both ways, both towards war and away from war. But it was a society with its tensions, and there had been a series of crises before 1914, which had, I think, in a dangerous way, accustomed people to the idea that there might be a general war, because every time there was a crisis, there was talk of war. Europe had divided itself up into two rather loose alliance systems, which tended to come into play when there was a crisis, people feeling they had to support their alliance partners or rein them in, but the alliances mattered. There was an arms race before 1914, which did, I think, add to the tensions. You did have also a lot of social tensions. I mean, a lot of the ruling classes in Europe were very worried about their own societies because there was a growth in the working class, there was a growth in socialism. You talked about anarchism. There was an international revolutionary anarchist movement which carried out a lot of very high-profile assassinations, not just of heads of state, although a lot of a Spanish prime minister, the Empress of Austria, the Tsar of Russia, and I mean a number of very high-profile assassinations, but also more ordinary people. I mean, there was an anarchist who went into a cafe in Paris and killed the first person he saw because he said to kill a member of the bourgeoisie is never a crime. Or bombs were thrown onto the floor of the French Stock Exchange. And so Europe was perhaps more troubled than we like to think, looking back. And I think by the summer of 1914, what you had was you know, you had enough causes there possibly for a war. But I think that the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and he was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, so it was a real blow to Austria-Hungary, and they took it as a tremendous insult, and they suspected that the little state of Serbia was behind it. I think it was the spark that set off the war. If it had been managed, that crisis, and previous ones had been managed, Europe might well have gone on in that state of sort of balance between the prospect of war and the prospect of peace. I don't think the war was inevitable. I think the real danger is we look back and we see so many reasons why it might have happened that we think, oh, it had to happen. And that's a leap of logic, which I just don't think can be sustained.
I just wanted to ask her that question. Having always sought recourse when my own students ask me what caused the First World War, to Baldrick in Blackadder Goes Forth saying that it was because Archduke shot an ostrich.
Yeah. There's a wonderful sketch which I can't remember about a bar fight. Do you know the one where, you know, Serbia kicks Austria-Hungary in the knees, And Germany says, why are you kicking my big brother in the knees? And then Russia says, you can't do that to little Serbia. And then the Americans come in and say, guys, can't we just calm down? Like, forget how it goes. You can find it on YouTube. It's very funny. But
That is one of the things that I think has always fascinated people about the Great War, is that it is astonishingly complicated. It is relatively simple in its execution by comparison to the Second War, which is wildly complicated. But it has always seemed to be, I think, quite inexplicable. When you do attempt to explain to students or to the public, as you've just done, how did this start? It takes a long time to tease that out.
Yeah. Well, I took 700 pages, and I'm not sure I've still teased it out. I think the mistake perhaps we all make is looking for a single cause, saying that's it. But this is not an Agatha Christie murder. We're not trying to finger the person or the country or the cause that did it. What I think, the only good analogy I can come up with is the perfect storm. A whole lot of things came together at once, and they came together in a particular order. There are all sorts of things that count. For example, the previous crises. Europe had had a series of crises from about 1905 onwards in which people had talked about war. And so I think psychologically a lot of people were getting used to the idea that we might have a general war. But what the crises also did was make people complacent. And so in 1914, when a crisis blew up over an incident in the Balkans, there had already been crises in 1911, 1912, and 1913. 1912 and 1913, the crises had in fact again been in the Balkans. And so what a lot of people said in the summer of 1914 is, here we go again, another of these crises. There'll be some, threats back and forth. There'll be a bit of military maneuvering. This is something they did. If you wanted to put pressure on the other side, you suddenly sent, an army corps up to the frontier just to make a point. And I think they were doing the same thing in the summer of 1914. They were beginning to do a bit of mobilization, calling a few officers back from holiday rather obviously. And I think a lot of people thought, we'll do the same sort of thing. Someone will back down. There'll be a conference of ambassadors. There'll be telegrams back and forth, and it'll all be sorted out. Because what's really striking to me is the Archduke was assassinated on the 28th of June, 1914. It wasn't really until about the 24th or the 25th of July that people began getting worried. And you read lots of accounts of people. Stefan Zweig, the writer from Vienna, was on holiday in Ostend in Belgium. And he said it was the usual summer holiday, the beach was fun, and the balloons were flying, and people were flying kites. And, we heard rumors of troubles, but we didn't pay any attention. Suddenly, he said, we all realized we had to get home. And it was almost overnight. And so I think there was a dangerous complacency that meant that people, including some of the statesmen, failed to take the crisis seriously enough, soon enough.
Part of dealing with such a complex event has in a way, you've probably said this publicly before, but it seems to have led you to a position that we should not be looking for moral lessons in history. Yeah. And I know you've been slightly embroiled in a bit of political mudslinging between the British Education Secretary, Michael Gove, and the Shadow Secretary, Tristan Hunt, about the origins of the conflict and the way that it's portrayed in popular culture. Can you tell us a little more about that episode?
Yeah. Well, so often I think when we look at history, we're preoccupied by the present. And so we look at the past in the light of what's going on in the present. And what you have, I think, this is what I've been feeling since I've been living in the UK, what you have is a UK which is uncertain about where it's going, which may be a smaller UK if the Scottish referendum goes another way, which is going through one of its periodic fits of trying to decide whether it's European or not, and having a sort of rather uneasy, or very uneasy relationship with the European Union, which is worried about immigration. There's a great deal of talk about what is it to be British anymore, this sort of thing. So it's an uneasy time in the UK. And I think, at least on the conservative side, there are people looking back at the First World War and seeing it as a time when Britain still really counted. Britain was the world power. The United States had not yet risen to world dominance, although it was clearly on the way up. But Britain still, and the British Empire, was still the biggest and most important power in the world. And so what I think a number of those, like Michael Gove, the education minister, are arguing is we should look at the First World War as a time when Britain counted, when we were fighting that war for a purpose, and it was a good purpose. We were fighting to prevent German domination of the continent and to preserve the dominance of the British Empire, but also British values, and to promote British values. And we have had enough of this gloomy view of the war, that it was all pointless, all futile, that people just sat in trenches in the mud with rats, and nothing, it was, or the Blackadder version, that all the officers were buffoons and idiots and the whole thing was completely pointless. And so I think this is what's been happening. But Michael Gove wrote, I thought, a rather intemperate article in which he said this. And he said, I've had enough of this, defeatist rubbish. And he got a number of responses, one from people who pointed out that the people who had said over the years that Britain shouldn't have gone into the war, that it was pointless, actually came from the right, which was slightly embarrassing. And I got involved a bit because I was misquoted. In the article it said, and the historian Margaret MacMillan agrees with my point of view, Gove's point of view, and British soldiers knew they were fighting for a Western liberal international order. And I never would have said that. And the idea that British soldiers went off in 1914, or New Zealand soldiers, or Canadian soldiers, Australians, saying, Mum and Dad, we're off to fight for a Western liberal international order, just doesn't make good history.
No.
And they didn't say that. I mean, what they said they were fighting for in the case of my Canadian ancestors was the mother country. I mean, they still saw Britain as the mother country. Or they were fighting, in the case of many, against what they saw as a German wish to dominate Europe. Or they were fighting for king and country, or they were just fighting for their families, or just fighting because they felt. But they did not go charging in saying Western liberal international order. Here we come. And what I said and what I would argue is, let us please leave the First World War out of these current political disputes, and let us try and remember it as something that, yes, of course, was important for each nation, but I would like to remember it internationally. And you and I were talking a bit about this beforehand. I mean, it was something. It was a catastrophe for European civilization, and indeed for much of the world. And I would like to remember it. I would like to try and remember it in a more international light. And let's look at, let's compare what happened to the different nations. Let's look at what it meant for Western civilization and for the world as a whole. And there are some signs that this is happening a bit. I mean, the French and the Germans are going to do some shared commemorations, and the British and the Germans are doing a shared commemoration. I think next Christmas they're going to share a commemoration of the Christmas truce. And there's going to be a good bit. And there's going to be a football game played by British and German football players, which we have to hope doesn't turn into something rather violent. So.
Yes, we hope there are not quite so many casualties.
Exactly.
Yes. I mean, reading Michael Gove's piece, what actually made me laugh out loud was blaming that myth of the futility of the war on the left-wing historians. And I kind of said, hang on a minute. Ernest Hemingway and Siegfried Sassoon, not left-wing historians. Yes, if you want to think about who was arguing the futility of the war, in large part it was the men who were there. Yeah. And I did find that curious, that he wanted to attach that to the left wing. Yeah.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, and Alan Clark, who was a Conservative cabinet minister, was the man who wrote in its own time, quite a notorious book called The Donkeys, which portrayed all the generals as, people with no brains in their heads who sat behind drinking champagne while they sent men over the top. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous view. And I think has been exploded by other historians, but no, it tends to come from the right. I mean, the other thing about the soldiers in the First World War, I think, is we have to we've been so influenced by, and it's very powerful and it's wonderful, by the war poetry and by the war memoirs, that we assume that all soldiers shared that sense of futility. Indeed. All soldiers didn't. I mean, a lot of soldiers did think they were fighting for something, and we may disagree with whether they should have been fighting for it. We may disagree that it was an important thing to fight for, whatever they thought they were fighting for, whether it was king and country, but I think we should respect that. And not all soldiers, and this is something very difficult, I think, for liberal societies to understand, not all soldiers thought the war was hopeless. Not all soldiers remembered it with horror. I mean, a lot of people joined veterans associations and went along to commemorate it. Right,
and in fact missed the camaraderie and the all-male world of the army. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the prime example is Adolf Hitler, who was the happiest time of his life was when
Perhaps
he was a corporal.
Not the ideal example.
Not the ideal
I was
example.
Thinking of somebody else.
Yeah, no. Well, it was there was a famous, I don't know if it's probably been done here in New Zealand, and then it was made a movie called Oh, What a Lovely War. which is a very critical look at the First World War, and was very powerful when it first came out. It came out, I think, in '65 in London as a stage play. A friend of mine went to the opening week, and this is very critical of the war, and it's meant to be exploding all the myths, and it sort of show the horror of the war. He went in the opening week, and he said a busload of veterans from the First World War came. He said they had the most wonderful evening. They sang along with all the songs. He said the bar was jammed in the interval, and they were all saying, "Bill, wasn't that great? Doesn't that take you back?" So, we have to remember that people remember things in different ways. I don't think there's one memory of the First World War. I think there are many.
Yes. So if the kind of overwhelming popular idea of the war in Britain is one of futility, what about in Canada? What are the myths there that perhaps might need to be unseated?
Yeah. Well, what's happening in Canada is quite interesting. Is we have the view of the federal government of how we should be thinking about it, and then we have what will happen. Right. I don't think governments should impose. Governments aren't good at writing history. I think when you get a government saying there's only one way to look at the war or look at a historical event, then I think you think no, there are usually many ways, and I think it's much. I prefer to say to people, look, there are many ways of interpreting this. Feel free, and understand that there are different. We don't all have to have the same view. The Canadian federal government, which is a conservative one, has been promulgating a view that Canada is a nation made on the battlefield, which I would have thought of all nations, we are not a nation made on the battlefield. And we had in 2012, there was a war that for the Canadians is remembered, nobody else much remembers it, called the War of 1812, when the British fought the Americans. And there was an American invasion force sent up into the British colony of Upper Canada, and it was beaten back. And the federal government said this is the moment at which Canada became a nation. These were Canadians fighting off the Americans. Well, it wasn't really. I mean, these were British soldiers and Aboriginal soldiers, Canadian and North American Indians fighting off the Americans. And so there was an attempt to portray this as a sort of great defining battleground moment in Canadian history. It fell sort of flat. And I think at the moment, the sort of official line, but I may be unfair because it changes, but the official line is that Vimy Ridge is the most important event in the First World War for Canadians. This was when Canadian forces in 1917 took a ridge that had been quite high ground in Belgium that had been held by German troops. And it was a very important victory. The British forces and the French had tried to take it before, and the Canadians succeeded in taking it. And there's a marvelous Canadian War Memorial there. But that seems to be the focus of at least official commemorations, which I think is a pity because we were in the war for 4 years, as were New Zealanders and Australians. And I think it's a mistake to focus on just one particular event. I mean, what I do think is going to happen in Canada and I imagine it will happen here, and it's certainly happening in the UK, there'll be a lot of grassroots things. People will do their own commemorations. The City of Toronto is going to do something, and there are various regions that will do something, and I've had emails from local libraries which want to do something, and I think this is good. I think the more we have and the more people are encouraged to do their own sort of commemoration, the better.
So how does that sit with your feeling that the professional historians have retreated a bit from this area and kind of left it to the amateurs, many of whom produce very good work, some of whom produce work kind of constrained by the myths?
I think historians have an obligation to get out there and get involved in these debates. I've sometimes got into trouble for using the term professional historian, but people assume that I mean only historians in universities, which I don't. What I mean by a professional historian is that those historians who take evidence seriously don't make arguments that the evidence doesn't support. I mean, bad history, I think, is when people put thoughts into people's minds. I remember reading a book on the French Revolution once which said Marie Antoinette looked out the window and thought, oh dear, I wonder what will happen, and a tear ran down her beautiful face. And I thought, you weren't there, there's no evidence that this happened, we don't know what she was thinking. That's what I call bad history, where you go beyond what the evidence will bear and you start putting thoughts and words into people's minds and into their voices. But I do think there's been a danger, I think, among those of us who work as historians to say we will only write for each other and we don't want to get involved in these public debates. And I think we ought to, because if we don't, others will. And I think our job, we're slight pains in the neck, I think, quite frankly. You may not be, but I am. We're sort of like the people, we can be the slightly boring people at the dinner party who, when someone's telling a story, say, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't on Wednesday that happened, it was Tuesday. But I think that's our responsibility in a way, to say no, or to say it's not as simple as that. You know, to say about the First World War, let's try and understand in its complexity, and let's try and understand why it was happening, what it meant. And let's not assume that, you know, I think we're partly about puncturing myths too. You know, nationalist myths, myths about people. I mean, let's try and understand the complexity of the world. I do think that's our job, and I do think we need to get involved.
It doesn't make us friends.
No.
No.
No. No, we can be a bit, you know, we can be pains in the neck. And I sometimes, I mean, yes, I mean, in every country will have its wars over history, and you know there are myths that people hold very strongly to. But you know, I think it can sometimes be good to break myths. I mean, Roy Foster, who's the most marvelous historian of Ireland, played a very important role in really undermining and in the end evaporating some of the nationalist myths. You know, there's a myth in Ireland, for example, among the Protestants of the North, that no Catholics ever fought in the First or Second World Wars, and he showed it wasn't true. And there were myths among the Catholics that Protestants, you know, were always hard-headed, you know, always, you know, ready to beat up Catholics. And he showed that it wasn't true. And he really helped to create a new version of Irish history, which I thought was really important.
Just to come back to your most recent work, one of the things that really struck me in The War That Ended Peace was in your taking a more biographical approach to many of the key players. What struck me was how utterly unelectable many of them would be today. They were idiosyncratic, they were odd, if they weren't in Parliament, they were at home not seeing anybody, or there are all sorts of things going on in their childhoods that I thought, no spin doctor could work with that. It just wouldn't happen. And that made me reflect a bit on the changing nature of leadership over the 20th century.
Yes, I suppose, yes, there are people in the past who wouldn't be elected today, and in some ways that's regrettable. I mean, you think of Winston Churchill,
right,
who might well not be elected today because he wouldn't fit you know, the mold of the sort of, you know, even his drinking, the bottle of champagne at lunch would probably cause heads to shake. And I think that's a shame. I think in a way we tend to hold our politicians to improbably high standards. And we don't expect them to ever have human failings, which I think is wrong. And I think it means that you will get people who would be very good leaders simply not going into the game because it's so, you know, their lives will be under such scrutiny. I mean, I think there was something in the paper this morning, I was reading the local paper, that Hollande, the president of France, is now only using texts to his girlfriend because they can't be picked up.
Right.
You know, and I do think you have to allow politicians to have private lives as long as they don't impinge on their politics and their decisions. I think what, of course, you also got in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, you got people who were hereditary rulers who continued to have a great deal of power. And quite frankly, the crowd who were in power, by and large, in 1914, are the single best argument against the hereditary principle for rulers. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was a man whose own father thought he wasn't up to much, thought he was stupid and never could make up his mind. I mean, he was a nice, kind, good family man who could have run a small business somewhere, possibly, but shouldn't have been running a very big country. And then you had, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who is fascinating. I mean, the trouble with him is you have to watch it because he'll take over the whole book, because he's such a flamboyant character. I mean, he's, you know, complicated, difficult, dreadful relations with his parents, alternatively belligerent and pacifist. He talked way too much, which didn't help. He was always giving his own views. He was one of these know-it-alls. He knew everything. I mean, he was always telling the British how to run their navy, which they didn't appreciate. There was a wonderful story once that he was at a concert and he thought the conductor was conducting too slowly, so he got up and took the baton and started to conduct. So, yeah. And so, you know, these people are fascinating because of the influence they have on politics. And because in the end, the Tsar of Russia was the one who had to sign the mobilization order, which committed Russia to war, and in the end, Wilhelm II could or could not, had the capacity to commit or not to commit Germany to war. And so I think you have to know about their personalities.
There are some terrific stories in the book. I think the one that stays with me is the French foreign minister who had to resign because his wife shot a newspaper editor.
Oh, yes. Yes, the French, he was a very interesting man called Joseph Caillaux, who had been prime minister and then finance minister, and he was known for his pro-German views. I mean, he was one of the French who argued, I think quite sensibly, that France and Germany should make it up and that they could work together. I mean, 100 years later, this has in fact happened.
Indeed.
It took quite a lot of time to get there. And Caillaux was in the government at the beginning of 1914, and one of his great political rivals was the editor of Figaro, which was a conservative newspaper, and the editor of Figaro was accusing Caillaux of corruption, which was probably true, and also getting at him for what was seen as pro-German views, and had got his hands on letters, love letters between Caillaux and his second wife, that they had been writing to each other at the time when he was still married to someone else, and so was she married to someone else. And so these were potentially very scandalous, and Madame Caillaux decided to defend her husband, and she always dressed beautifully, and she took she had a little fur muff, and she put her pistol inside it, and she went to the editor of the offices of Figaro and said, "I'd like to see the editor," and they said, "Absolutely, madame." And she went in. The editor of Figaro was quite pleased because she was a lovely woman, and she pulled out a revolver and shot him dead. And as a result, Caillaux had to resign from the government.
Indeed.
And so you could argue if he'd been in the French government when the crisis blew up, he might have been an advocate for peace rather than war. And in fact, it also distracted the French because her trial was going on just as the crisis was on. And if you look at French newspapers at the time, it's all about the trial. And she'd appear in the witness box with a little handkerchief and looking gorgeous. And she was let off, actually. just to end that story. She got off.
Not have sympathy.
Yeah, she got off.
Rebecca Brooks probably got off quite lightly, we think, yes. I confess to being quite relieved, Margaret, when I got to the end of your book and I was going through the acknowledgements, as other authors always do, and you thanked your colleagues and you admitted that sometimes when you'd been working on the book, you'd wander around the office like a Monty Python character who complained that his head hurt. Yeah. And I have to say, that made me feel quite relieved, because part of what I find astonishing about this book is, was how on earth did you figure out it hadn't been written before? Because that was your first response to your publisher, wasn't it? And then how did you go about actually writing a book out of what is a massive amount of evidence?
Yeah. It wasn't easy. I mean, I've decided that writing books is it's like an iceberg. What you finally see is only a fraction of what happens under the surface.
Exactly.
And I took a year's leave from my job in Oxford, and I went back to Toronto and became a sort of more than slightly bizarre hermit. I stayed in, and I said to all my family and friends, I'm only coming out after dark. And I would sort of come out after dark in a rather vampirish way. And I sat there for about 4 months trying to get my material into any sort of shape. And I did begin to panic because I thought, I'm never going to start writing this book. And I was getting rather chirpy emails from my publisher saying, I hope all's going well. And when can we expect to see something? And because it's getting it all organized. And what I do is I make all sorts of separate folders. And structure begins to emerge. And one of the things I had to decide was where I was going to start. Because I thought initially I'd do a book just focused on July 1914. And then I realized, from my point of view, I couldn't, because I had to explain why Britain was in a particular, for example, why the British took a particular policy at this time, and why on earth in 1914 the British found themselves on the same side as France and Russia, who were long-standing enemies. So I had to go back. And so I decided I'd go back to about 1900, because I thought that's really when I needed to begin the story. And once I got the first chapter done, it became easier.
Right.
And as I was writing the chapter, you must do this too, you're always thinking ahead, and you're sort of blocking things off in your mind, and you're thinking, well, I really will need to have a chapter. I thought at some point I've got to have a chapter on the war plans. How were they actually thinking of fighting? And then that became 2 chapters, because I thought I have to have a chapter on what was changing in war and how they were thinking about war. And so it gradually gets into shape, and the last bit's always the quickest, because you've said most of what you want to say. But I got very interested just at the end in the opening battles of the First World War, and so I was writing away. I'd already sent a lot off to my publisher, and I was writing away on the opening battles, and I got this sort of slightly panicky email from London saying, would you just please stop now? So I did.
That section on what had changed in war, I think, is tremendously useful, and that one of those enduring myths of the war is that no one knew the war would turn out like this, and that soldiers going or particularly regular soldiers, had no idea what they were going to face. But actually what you show is that they did.
Yeah.
They all knew really what they were going to face.
I don't think the ordinary soldiers did, but certainly a lot of the military thinkers and planners did. I mean, they were made very uneasy by the fact that war was changing. I mean, what was happening with the technology was that the power of the defense was getting much greater than the power of the offense, and so it was getting much more costly in terms of casualties, in terms of the number of men you needed to carry out a successful offense. I mean, one rule of thumb was you needed 8 times as many attackers as defenders, because the technology meant that defenders could dig themselves in, be virtually invisible on the battlefield. Gunpowder was now smokeless, so you didn't even see a telltale puff of smoke. And they had faster, more accurate rifles which could fire more often, repeating rifles. They had machine guns, of course, by 1914. Field artillery was also a lot better, could fire further. So anyone attacking had to come through a rain of fire over a much longer period. I mean, in the Napoleonic Wars, you had 100 yards that you had to get at before you could be on top of the enemy, and now it was more like 1,000 yards, or even longer, which meant that attacking was very, very difficult. And there were plenty of examples of wars which showed this. The American Civil War, the Russo-Turkish War in 1877, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, and then, of course, the more recent wars in the Balkans. And for the military planners, this was a real dilemma, because they didn't feel they could win wars by just sitting there and waiting for someone else to attack. And so they had to keep on thinking in terms of an offensive. And there was military sort of law, with military belief that you can't win a war unless you get out there and defeat the enemy. You have to go and look for a decisive victory. And so how to do it? And so I think increasingly they resorted to psychological means. If you can inspire the soldiers, they'll run farther and faster. They also, I think, really became, I think, like gamblers, wishful thinkers. They thought if we throw it all in, we might just win a victory. And the alternative, which I think a number of them sort of knew uneasily in their bones, was that there would be a stalemate. Lord Kitchener, who became Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, said the war will last at least 3 years. So it wasn't they didn't know, it was they didn't know what else to do. And so they went into the First World War, I think, in this rather desperate spirit of we've got to gamble and let's hope it works.
And that desperate spirit certainly comes out in, you've got that wonderful section of the letters the leaders wrote, often to their wives, on the eve of the declaration. That all those British leaders writing home saying, we're here and I just don't know what else to do now. And there's a terrible sense of dread and failure in those letters.
I think so. Not everyone, but this is another myth, I think, that Europeans welcomed the war in 1914 with cheering, and that the troops marched off with everyone throwing flowers at them, and it was all tremendously exciting. I mean, I think from the sort of ruling elites on down, there was a feeling of helplessness, that we're being swept into something we don't necessarily know what it's going to be like, and we're not sure we want to be swept. I think a lot of people, particularly among the ordinary public, were shocked. They got used to a long period of peace. Europe had, for Europe, a really extraordinary period since 1815 with very few wars. And those wars were mostly, except for the Crimean War, only between two nations. They hadn't had a general war as they had had in the Napoleonic Wars and as they had had in the wars of Louis XIV, or they'd had earlier, the 30 Years' War. I mean, this war, the wars they had seen had been very short and decisive. And so I think a lot of Europeans were just stunned by the fact that they were going to war. And some were pessimistic. Housewives were stockpiling food. They were having to see their husbands and their sons and their fathers go off to war. And so I think a lot of people really were horrified by what had happened. But you get a feeling, particularly in that last week of the crisis from about the 27th of July to the 4th of August, that they are simply being swept along. And there's this awful sense that we can't back down now because we'll look weak. And so the Germans felt they had to back, they'd already made the promise, but they felt they had to back Austria-Hungary because otherwise they'd lose their only remaining ally. And the Russians felt they had to back Serbia because otherwise they wouldn't be seen as a great power anymore. I mean, you get people saying in St. Petersburg, we have to back Serbia this time, otherwise we can't hold up our heads as a great power. And you get the French knowing that the Germans are going to attack. There's not much they can do, but what, of course, they want to do is make sure that Russia comes into the war. And then the last piece of the sort of whole thing is Britain coming in, which they do on the 4th of August 1914. And the British feel that it's British national interests, they have to come in. And so I think you get a sense, really, in that last week of people just being overtaken by events. And of course, a lot of them are very tired. I think we don't factor that in enough. I mean, a lot of them are extremely tired. They've been up all night. Telegrams are coming in the whole time. In a lot of the Foreign Offices, people are sleeping on camp beds. And I think they're tired, they're edgy, and they have this awful feeling, what else can they do?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to open up for questions in just a moment. I've just got one more question for Margaret. If you have a question, it would be good if you could formulate it to be succinct and erudite. That would be good. Thank you. So just my last question, Margaret. Just going back to Peacemakers, you had quite a lot of trouble finding a publisher for that book, didn't you? And partly publishers responded by saying, no, we don't want to talk about dead white men just right now, but actually then 10 years later everybody did. And I wonder whether you're concerned at all for the state of history publishing now.
I'm concerned for the state of publishing in general, because I think what's happening is publishers, the industry is by and large getting more concentrated. And I think there's a real search for the next bestseller. And what it means is publishers aren't doing as much what they used to do, and that is fostering younger writers, publishing things which maybe don't sell that many copies, but help to develop the next generation. I mean, a lot, including me. I mean, I had written another book. My first book didn't sell all that many, but it had given me some experience and it got me used to writing books. I'm not sure I would have found a publisher these days. And so I think it is dangerous, and they're not keeping up their backlists as well. I think it used to be that publishers kept books in print for a long time, but I've noticed increasingly, 2 years after a novel comes out, I decide to order it and it's no longer in print and you have to go to a secondhand book site to try and find it. And I do think that's a problem. I mean, I think you see this hunt for the stars in everything. You see it in opera, you see it in movies, you see it in sport. The people at the very top, are the mega stars. But you do need to develop. You need to keep developing them. And I think publishing, I think there's a danger here that the younger writers are just not getting the chances that we got. It's too expensive now to publish, or publishers are just on this hunt. And not all. I mean, there are honorable exceptions to this, but I think it's a worry. I think sometimes historians haven't helped themselves, because I think we've sometimes started writing in a very abstruse way, and we write for other historians. It's always, because so much of academic promotion and tenure is now tied to what you publish.
Indeed.
And, you have to publish in these very serious journals, but there's a sort of tendency to write in a way that isn't a great deal of fun. So.
Not for the writer and not for the reader, no. So I'm going to open up now. I have our very agile microphone runners. Could I ask that you please wait for a microphone to arrive before you ask a question? Thank you.
You've spoken about the status of professional historians as against amateur historians, and how important it is for them to rely on evidence. But haven't professional historians been guilty at times of selectively using evidence to pursue a particular point of view that they want to project?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we'd both agree with you on that. I mean, historians can be as guilty as anyone else of having agendas. And, the prime examples of this, I mean, after the First World War, the German Foreign Office set up a section which was well-funded and well-staffed, devoted to showing that Germany was not responsible for the First World War. And this had a very important political purpose, because if Germany could be shown not to be responsible for the First World War, then the treaty that Germany had signed at Versailles would be seen as illegitimate. Germany shouldn't have had to accept some of the more punitive clauses in that treaty. And they selectively released documents which were very carefully chosen to show that Germany was no more guilty than anyone else. And they also published a huge series of documents which they took from other nations as well, because a lot of things had been published in the course of the war and just afterwards. And again, these were put together in a way to show that, at least to give an impression that Europe just fell over the edge into war and it wasn't anyone's fault. And they also gave access to a couple of American historians, for example, Sidney Fay and Harry Elmer Barnes, who then went back to the United States and wrote books saying, it's all so unfair, Germany really doesn't bear any responsibility for the war, which had a very important impact in the United States and played into US isolationism. So no, I agree. I think historians can be guilty of using documents selectively, and we have to be really careful about it. And there's still cases where this happens. I mean, there was a huge controversy over a book on the Nazi rise to power, where it turned out that documents had been selectively used. And you can also, you can cut bits out and have them say perhaps what they didn't say. So no, I agree. But it's why we get into arguments with each other. And I do think you have to guard against that. No, absolutely. There's a gentleman down here.
That's right.
Yeah.
Our runners are on it.
I'm losing my...
Thank you.
You mentioned the tear running down Marie Antoinette's face.
Yeah.
You also mentioned how pleased the newspaper editor was to see the politician's wife before she shot him dead. I'm curious how you know. More broadly, I'm curious how a professional historian resists the temptation to embroider, to get into the story.
Yeah. Well, the tear running down Marie Antoinette's face, there was no basis for it, and we didn't know what was going on in her head, and she didn't say to someone with her in the room. I mean, sometimes we know what people are thinking because they turn to someone who keeps a diary and says, you know, I've absolutely had it with so-and-so, and someone makes a note of it. In the case of the editor of Figaro, the witnesses, the testimony from the office boy, for example, who went in and said, Madame Caillot is here, and he said, wonderful, show her in. You know, so we did have direct eyewitness testimony there. But you're absolutely right. I think we have to be very careful. I mean, I am careful too when I use, even at the time, people will write documents to cover themselves. You know, there's a famous series of telegrams between Wilhelm II and Nicholas II of Russia just before the final outbreak of the war, which are known as the Willy-Nicky telegrams, because that's how they addressed each other. And interestingly enough, they wrote to each other in English, which was one of their common languages. And when you read them, you can see that they're very much, particularly the Kaiser's, very much for future consumption. I mean, as he is already knows that Germany's armies are mobilizing, he sends a telegram to Nicholas saying, my dear cousin, you know, please tell me you don't want war, please back down, we don't want war, we would never do anything warlike. And so you read those, I think, you always have to understand the context, and you read them with a grain of salt. I'm also always treat memoirs with care, because when people write after the event, they often have a reason they're writing after the event. And after the First World War, there were endless memoirs from generals, statesmen, saying, you know, wasn't me, Gov, you know, not my fault. So you read those with some care. But you try always to get more than one piece of evidence, particularly something very controversial. And when you don't have the evidence, I think you have to say so. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation. And the third week in July, the French president and the French government minister responsible for foreign affairs were both in St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia. And they were having discussions with the Russians. And it is probable, I mean, it's known that they talked about the crisis unfolding in the Balkans, but we don't know in detail what they said. And some historians have speculated about what they said, and I think you have to be really careful. We just don't know. The record isn't there, and we probably never will know. It's just, there's not enough of a record. But you're right, we have to be careful.
Good morning, Professor MacMillan. I was just wondering, what do you believe to be the most pervasive myth about the origins of the First World War that still exists today, and how would you puncture that? Or
it's hard to choose the most persistent one. I mean, one is the one that I referred to, that Europeans welcomed the war with delight, and that they went charging off. You know, in a spirit of enthusiasm. I do think that's one of the persistent myths. I'm trying to think of, I'm sorry, I'm not good on myths. I'm trying to think of another one, which, I mean, certainly you get into the war, the myth that all the generals were donkeys and didn't know what they were doing. I mean, you had a number of very good generals who were very concerned about what was going on and kept on trying to think of ways to break the deadlock, particularly the deadlock on the Western Front. So I think that's another myth, which I think is in process of being punctured. But I think the myths around the origins of the First World War, we've argued over it so much that I don't think there are any really enduring ones, because for pretty much any myth you can find a counter one. I mean, what you do get, certainly in sort of offhand comments in the press, for example, about it, is the First World War. There's a famous phrase in Lloyd George's memoirs, which are highly unreliable, and although interesting, but there's a phrase there where he said, Europe slithered over the edge into war, you know, unconcerned and unheeding. I forget the exact words. And that is a persistent myth, that the Europeans sleptwalked into war. They didn't know what they were doing. They just sailed over the edge. And I don't think that's true. I think quite a few people knew what they were doing. Those who were making decisions in Berlin and those who were making decisions in Austria-Hungary knew they were risking a general war, and they went ahead and did it anyway.
I was just wondering about the death of Edward VII. I mean, the British king had quite a responsibility for British foreign policy, and when he died, there seemed to be an awful vacuum. Is that a reasonable kind of thing? Because I mean, he could have talked to Wilhelm, could have talked to Nicholas, and say, you young guys, you behave yourselves.
Yeah. If Edward VII had said that to Wilhelm, it would have had the opposite effect. Edward VII was the uncle. It was the son of Queen Victoria who became king at the beginning of the 20th century. He and his nephew did not get on at all. They hated each other. And so if Edward VII had said to Wilhelm II, behave yourself, it would have produced a dreadful reaction, I think. I think it's been much overstated, actually. I mean, a lot of these monarchs were related to each other. Edward VII was the uncle of Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II and Nicholas II were closely related. George V was a cousin both of Nicholas II and a cousin or a second cousin of Wilhelm II. But I think the family ties can be overdone. These people identified with their own countries, and they saw themselves in many cases as being put there by God. I mean, there really was a sort of mystical thing that this is my country. The Tsar saw himself as responsible for Russia, he believed the Romanov dynasty was Russia, and he didn't see much distinction between them. Wilhelm II saw himself as Germany, and that was his responsibility, and the kings of England saw themselves as the kings of England. In any case, I don't think Edward VII's disappearance meant all that much in terms of British policy. In Britain, the constitutional situation was very different than it was in Germany, Austria-Hungary, or Russia. The king had very little formal power. Edward VII had been very helpful in bringing about a better relationship with France, but he had done it because his government wished to have a better relationship with France. He hadn't done it on his own bat, and if he'd tried to do it on his own bat and the government hadn't wanted it, he would have got himself into trouble. George V, who succeeded him, played very little part in foreign affairs. He did more or less what his government told him. But I think the family relationships actually, by this point, don't mean all that much, if they ever did. And of course, we all know that even though you're closely related, doesn't mean you're going to get on all that well. So,
Thank you. Up the back.
Just briefly, you said a lot about the European powers except for Austria-Hungary. I was wondering if you'd like to perhaps give some comments about the internal tensions within the empire that may have forced them to push the ultimatum to Serbia, and also something about what they might have felt at the end of the war when they saw their whole world collapse.
yeah. Thank you. It's a very good question. Austria-Hungary was this extraordinary multinational empire at the center of Europe, which had lasted for centuries and had managed to keep a sort of peace between all its different peoples. I think the Austro-Hungarian army used 12 main languages, which will give you an idea of the complexity of that empire. And what they saw, I mean, they were aware of the growing power of nationalism. I mean, it wasn't something that had troubled them or troubled much of Europe until the 19th century, but as you began to get these very strong nationalisms, you got groups within Austria-Hungary who began to push for more and more autonomy and eventually for independence. And so the Czechs, for example, were at loggerheads with the German speakers and increasingly pushing for more autonomy. There were Italians in the south who really, I think, were talking of leaving Austria-Hungary, or some of them were, and joining with Italy. There were, of course, a lot of South Slavs, Croatians, Slovenians, and Serbians living within Austria-Hungary. And increasingly, Serbia was becoming a magnet for at least some of them. And the Serbian government itself, after 1903, was hostile towards Austria-Hungary and was actually stirring up and encouraging separatist movements among fellow South Slavs living within Austria-Hungary. And so Austria-Hungary and the ruling classes, who were very integrated, I mean, if you look at the old names of the Austro-Hungarians, I mean, they're Italian, they're Polish, they're Czech, German. It's a very, very international world, and most of them spoke several languages. I mean, it was quite commonplace, and the emperor himself would speak Hungarian, German, French, Italian, possibly Czech. I mean, this was just something you did if you were educated. And I think those who were in charge in Austria-Hungary were very worried about the corrosive power of nationalism. And increasingly, they saw Serbia as their main threat, because Serbia was acting as a magnet to pull the South Slavs out of the southern part of Austria-Hungary. And if any of those South Slavs had gone, the Poles in the north, the Ruthenians in the east, the Czechs and possibly Slovaks would have begun to want to go as well. And so I think for Austria-Hungary, Serbia became increasingly the focus of their fears, and they saw it as a real menace. And so when the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo, which was in Bosnia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it had been annexed in 1908, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by people who, some of whom were Serb, some of whom were Bosnian nationalists from Croatia, and there was even a Muslim, but it was pretty clear, and most people assumed, that the Serbian government or elements of the Serbian government were in some way complicit in this. And the weapons they used had come from the Serbian military armory. They had practiced firing in a park in Belgrade. They had been smuggled over the border with their weapons and their capsules of cyanide to take if they were captured, with the acquiescence of Serbian border guards. And so the Austrians thought, this is the opportunity we've been waiting for. They've killed. We haven't got direct proof, and that was part of the problem, but we're pretty sure Serbia is behind it. Serbia has done this outrageous, or encouraged this outrageous and provocative thing. We will get them. And this is the perfect opportunity. We will clean out, as they said in the language at the time, we will clean out that nest of vipers. We'll sort them out. And the chief of the Austrian General Staff had been saying, a man called Konrad von Hotzendorf, had been saying this frequently over the previous years. We've got to finish Serbia, we've got to finish Serbia. And now he and others who felt like him were going to prevail. So it's a very, very important factor. I think if Austria-Hungary had not decided to destroy Serbia, we might well not have got a war. And of course, then the next crucial step was when Germany on the 5th of July said to Austria-Hungary, okay, we back you. We give you what came to be called the blank check. Do what you want. Even if there's risk of Russia coming in to support Serbia, we will support you. And that's when Europe moves much, much closer to a general war.